Dr. Bacchial, most of the people in the audience, both here live and as well as those virtually, know him and of his reputation in research growth hormone. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce or turn the floor over to you, Dr. Bacchial. And after you're finished with your portion, I'll bring up and introduce Carrie Marone, who's with Ascendis Pharmaceutical and who'll be moderating the questions that will come after your presentation. So thank you very much again for joining us.
Hey, thank you for this introduction, Joel. It's good to see your face and Paul's, and greetings to everybody who's listening. And I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person, but I feel that in the not so distant future, this will all change. So let me just minimize the little screen here with the participants, and let's go ahead here. So again, thanks for this invitation. Greetings to everybody who's there in Austin at the PESTOLA meeting, which I know is always a great meeting, and greetings to anybody listening in virtually. So what I'm going to do today is to introduce to you Skytrofa, or Lonapec somatropin, which is the first once-weekly treatment for pediatric growth hormone deficiency that has been FDA approved. So this is a sort of a product theater presentation. This is a presentation that is sponsored by Ascendis Pharma, and there is compensation for the presenter. But all information that I will share with you is consistent with the FDA guidelines. So as I mentioned before, I'm introducing to you the first once-weekly treatment with a long-acting growth hormone product for children with growth hormone deficiency. So Lonapec somatropin, or Skytrofa, is a human growth hormone that's indicated for the treatment of pediatric patients that are at least 1 year of age or older and who weigh at least 11.5 kilograms and have their growth failure secondary to growth hormone deficiency. Although not part of the phase 2 and phase 3 trials, there are some important pieces of information regarding the safety of growth hormone treatment that you will see in the package insert in the label for Skytrofa. And these include not to prescribe growth hormone therapy for children with acute critical illnesses or who have hypersensitivity to somatropin, who don't have the possibility to grow anymore, who have an active malignancy, active proliferative diabetic retinopathy, or who have Prader-Willi syndrome as an underlying diagnosis with respiratory compromise. So this information also needs to be shared, even though it was not part of the findings in the phase 2 and phase 3 trials. It is a growth hormone. So it is growth hormone, human growth hormone, or somatropin. And this Lonapec somatropin is a long-acting growth hormone that belongs to the category of prodrugs. It is composed, as you can see in the figure, of somatropin that has the exact 191 amino acid sequence and the exact identical molecular weight of 22 kilodalton as endogenous growth hormone. This somatropin in Skytrofa is transiently bound or conjugated to a methoxypolyethylene glycol carrier, and this binding occurs via a proprietary transcorl linker, which you can see in the figure as sort of a yellow connecting piece. So somatropin remains inactivated as long as it's shielded by the carrier. Until it's released from the carrier, somatropin is not active. Once it's released, somatropin will then act as endogenous growth hormone does. It can bind to the growth hormone receptor and it can exert its pharmacodynamic effects. So somatropin will then stimulate skeletal growth in pediatric patients with growth hormone deficiency, both through direct growth hormone effects as well indirectly through its pharmacodynamic effects with the production of IGF-1. We can talk a little bit more about the pharmacokinetics. With regards to the absorption and distribution following the subcutaneous injection of once weekly Lonapec somatropin or Skytrofa, the growth hormone or somatropin is released as a fully active somatropin, and this occurs after non-enzymatic autocleavage of somatropin from the transcon linker. This occurs in a controlled manner that follows first order kinetics, meaning that it's determined by the molar concentration of the reagent of the product. There is no significant accumulation observed with Skytrofa, nor for Skytrofa as the complex molecule or somatropin alone after repeat dose administration. And there is a similar distribution pattern as observed for daily somatropin. From an elimination or excretion perspective, the metabolic fate of somatropin involves both protein catabolism in the liver and in the kidneys, and the carrier and proprietary linker molecules are cleared predominantly by the kidney. Although in pediatric patients with growth hormone deficiency following subcutaneous administration of Skytrofa, an observed mean half-life of over 30 hours is noted, the apparent half-life of somatropin itself, once it's released from Skytrofa, is approximately 25 hours. Let's talk a little bit now about the Pediatric Growth Hormone Deficiency Program, which includes the phase 3 clinical trial for which I will present the efficacy and safety data today. There were two parallel trials going on. One's called the HEIGHT trial and one is called the FLIGHT trial. We will focus today on the HEIGHT trial, which was a multi-center study that treated treatment-naive children with growth hormone deficiency between 3 and 11 years of age for girls and 3 and 12 years of age for boys. 161 patients were enrolled in this trial, which was a one-year trial, and patients were randomized to receive either long-acting Lonapec somatropin or Skytrofa, or a daily somatropin, which in this case was genotropin. The other trial is a trial in which patients were treated with Skytrofa only, but those patients had already been exposed to daily growth hormone therapy. They were treatment-experienced patients, and the age range was different. All these patients are now enrolled in an ongoing long-term extension trial. There's close to 300 patients enrolled in the extension trial with over 200 patient years of experience so far. So the trial we're going to focus on today is the phase 3 trial in the treatment-naive patients. So as I mentioned, 161 patients were included in this trial, and you can see in the box on the left what the key inclusion criteria were. All patients enrolled had to be prepubertal. They had to have growth hormone deficiency. You can see the age range for boys and girls, and they all had to be treatment naive. The height SDS for these patients had to be equal to or less than -2. IGF-1 concentrations were equal to or less than -1 SD, and the patients all underwent 2 growth hormone stimulation tests to confirm the diagnosis of growth hormone deficiency. Growth hormone peaks had to be less than or equal to 10 nanograms per ml, and patients had to have bone age delay. There were some obvious exclusion criteria, like for any growth trial in children. They had to have open epiphysis, and their nutritional status had to be normal, of course. So these patients were then randomized in a 2-to-1 fashion to either receive once weekly Skytrofa at a dose of 0.24 milligrams per kilogram per week, or they received daily growth hormone injections at a similar total weekly dose of 0.24 milligrams per kilogram per week. So here you see the main efficacy data from this study. You can see on the left annualized height velocity, and on the right the change from baseline for height standard deviation score at week 52. So the treatment difference for annualized height velocity with the long-acting Skytrofa compared with daily somatropin was 0.9 centimeters per year. Respectively, the annualized height velocity was 11.2 centimeters versus 10.3 centimeters. This translated to a height SDS change from baseline of plus 1.1 standard deviations for the Skytrofa cohort and plus 0.9 standard deviations for the daily somatropin cohort. We can see here on this slide that the sustained linear growth was achieved through week 52 in these treatment-naive patients. But if you look at the height SDS change from baseline here in gray for the daily growth hormone treated patients and in red for the Skytrofa treated patients, you can see that the difference was there already early on in the trial, but the significant difference was only noticeable at week 26. What about safety issues? We can say that there were no serious adverse reactions or treatment discontinuations observed. In the table, you can see the adverse reactions that occurred with a frequency of at least greater than 5% more often than with the daily somatropin-treated pediatric patients. And you can see that the typical adverse reactions reported in this study were the reactions that we usually see when children are enrolled in clinical trials like this. They get upper respiratory infections, they get fevers, they have cough, nausea, vomiting, etc. And the numbers are approximately twice as common in the Skytrofa group, but the N is twice as high in that group. Only about 6% of patients in the Skytrofa group showed detectable anti-growth hormone antibodies at any time. And this compared with about 3.6% in the daily somatropin group. But when submitted to a cell-based assay to look at the potential neutralizing effect, no neutralizing antibodies were detected in either cohort. The laboratory parameters in this trial were generally stable throughout the 52 weeks of treatment and remained normal for all those measured. And just a summary here of some of the key parameters: hemoglobin A1C and glucose. This is fasting glucose, remained pretty much stable throughout the treatment. The same can be said for cortisol concentrations, thyroid hormone concentrations, and TSH values. The body mass index SDS also remained comparable to baseline throughout the studies, although a mild difference was seen in the Skytrofa group versus the daily somatropin group. In the Skytrofa group, there was a mild increase in body mass index SD score of plus 0.3. In the daily somatropin group, there is a mild decrease in BMI SDS of minus 0.3, with a in-between difference for the two groups of about plus 0.6 SD at the end of the trial at 52 weeks. This slide shows you the effect of growth hormone administration, in this case Skytrofa, on the IGF-1 concentrations. So it's obvious that with a long-acting growth hormone, the IGF-1 profile is going to be different between the different injections that are given, in this case here, weekly apart, compared to daily growth hormone therapy, where IGF-1 concentrations are essentially stable after having reached a steady state on any day during treatment. It's different for long-acting growth hormone products, and here you see the typical profile for IGF-1 expressed in standard deviations after treatment with Skytrofa. This was done at week 13 when steady state was definitely reached. And at steady state, you can see that the IGF-1 concentrations peak at approximately 48 hours or 2 days after the dose of Skytrofa was administered, with the mean weekly IGF-1 concentration coinciding with about 4.5 days after the dose is given. You can see that the range of IGF-1 concentrations between peak at 48 hours and trough just before the next injection is about +2 standard deviations. During the different trials, including phase 2 trials, it was observed that there is a strong linear relationship between the somatropin released from a dose of Skytrofa administered and the IGF-1 response we see. For example, a change in 0.02 milligrams per kilogram of somatropin released from Skytrofa will result in a change of 0.17 standard deviation score for IGF-1. A little bit more about the IGF-1 pattern. Here we're looking at the estimated average IGF-1 SDS over 52 weeks of treatment. This is estimated based on population pharmacodynamic modeling. You can see here, again in red, the IGF-1 concentrations average for the Skytrofa cohort and compared in gray, dark gray for the daily somatropin cohort at the different weeks during the trial. And you can see that with the Skytrofa treated patients, you see a more rapid increase of the IGF-1 concentration to the range between 0 and +2 SD, and higher concentrations of IGF-1 within that range are observed throughout the trial as compared with the daily somatropin treated patients. The mean value of the average IGF-1 in this trial is plus 0.72 for the Skytrofa treated cohort, and that compares with the mean average IGF-1 for the daily somatropin group close to 0. It's actually minus 0.02. What about peak concentrations, which, as I told you, occur at 48 hours, and trough concentrations, which occur just prior to the next injection? The trough concentrations were measured at week 5 and week 52. The peak concentrations shown here were observed at weeks 13, 26, and 39, respectively. And all this is compared with the baseline pre-dose IGF-1 concentrations. And if we look and sort of try to estimate here what the average or mean IGF-1 at peak is, it is just above +1 SD. So the mean IGF-1 at peak is +1.2 standard deviations. And if you look at the trough, the mean IGF-1 at trough is about -0.7. The highest IGF-1 values are observed during the peak time at around 48 hours. And that's where you can see values, individual values, as you can see here on the slide, that range all the way up to +3 to +4 standard deviations. But when we go back to the estimated average IGF-1 SD scores here on the previous slide, we can make a statement about how often IGF-1 values reach a concentration above +2 SD. And in about 7.6% of patients treated with Skytrofa, one observed one or more values greater than +2. And this compared to about 3.6% of patients on daily growth hormone who had one or more values greater than +2 SD. If you look at consecutive values, that prevalence or that frequency dropped to below 3% for the Skytrofa group. But we also observe that when it comes down to the average IGF-1 SD, no values above +3 were detected, were observed. I need to just stress again a couple of these safety issues that are part of the package insert and the labeling for growth hormone products, and that all endocrinologists are very well familiar with. I mentioned the hypersensitivity. and the contraindication to treat in patients who may have an increased risk for malignancy because they have a rare genetic disease that predisposes them, or in childhood cancer survivors who were treated with radiation, there is an increased risk if they were treated with somatropin for a second neoplasm. Other things that we're familiar with is that with any growth hormone product, one needs to be aware of the potential development of intracranial hypertension, the potential development of slip capital femoral epiphyses, especially in patients who have a very strong response to being started on growth hormone therapy. And we're also aware, again, that patients who are treated with glucocorticoids may require an increased dose of their glucocorticoids if they start growing better. The same thing if patients are not treated for hypothyroidism that may become clinically manifest. These are all things that can be found in the package insert. Let's spend the last couple of minutes of this presentation on how this novel drug needs to be dosed and how it is administered in patients with growth hormone deficiency. So this long-acting growth hormone, Skytrofa, comes in single-use prefilled cartridges that are available in 9 different dosage strengths. And the table shows you which doses are available. There is an approximately 20% difference between each dose, and this decision of the 20% dose increase between the cartridges is based on data that have been available from large registries like KIGS, and also are based on information obtained from the earlier trials with Skytrofa. So the recommended dose for Skytrofa, whether they're treatment naive to growth hormone therapy or whether they're transition patients, is 0.24 milligrams per kilogram per week. This is given once weekly, should therefore be given subcutaneously about 7 days apart, but there is a window of 4 days during which this can safely be administered. So for example, if a patient misses a dose on the day that he or she was scheduled for, the dose can still be administered on day 8 or day 9, but not after that. And if a missed dose is anticipated in advance, the dose can actually be given 1 or 2 days earlier. So there's this window between 5 to 9 days after the prior dose where it is safe to give the next dose of Skytrofa. It should not be administered sooner than 5 days after the prior dose, and not after 9 days. If it's at all not given 9 days after the prior dose, one should then go further to the next scheduled dose that was planned on the usual day of administration. You can see that the approximate volumes after reconstitution are relatively small. As little as 0.27 mLs will be injected with the smallest dose, and as much as 0.6 mLs for the highest dose of 13.3. For patients who weigh more than 60.4 kilograms, so for some of the adolescents, 2 doses using 2 specific cartridges, as you can see on the table, may be needed to arrive to these doses of 15.2, 18.2, and 22 milligrams, all the way up to 100 kilograms. Dose calculation is pretty straightforward. This is a weight-based treatment. You need to have the patient's body weight, and you need to remember that the dose is standard 0.24 milligrams per kilogram per week. So these cartridges are designed in such a way that they need to be given with an injection device. This auto-injector is a reusable, durable device that can stay with the patient for up to 5 years. The lyophilized product is in the cartridge, which is a dual chamber cartridge. And then the mixing occurs through a fully automatic reconstitution process with cues given by the auto-injector. There's one manual step, but even that is indicated by the auto-injector, and then how to administer it is all cued by sounds and lights that you can become familiar with once you get trained in how to use the auto-injector. The needles that are used with the auto-injector are similar to the ones we use for daily growth hormone therapies. The delivery is through a ultra-fine short needle, 0.25 millimeters, 31 gauge, 4 millimeters long. The injections are given subcutaneously, and the recommendation is to give them either in the lower abdomen, thighs, or buttocks. Skytrofa doesn't need to be refrigerated for up to 6 months. It can be stored at room temperature. Once it's reconstituted, one has 4 hours to give the injection. If the Skytrofa was refrigerated prior to reconstitution, it needs to be kept outside of the refrigerator for at least 15 minutes before reconstitution can occur in a good manner. During the trials, there were questionnaires or surveys provided to the participants, to the study subjects and their caregivers, to see what the preference was compared with the daily growth hormone injections. 90% of the parents or caregivers preferred the weekly injection, and the main reason was that many more injections did not need to be given. There were 80% fewer injections in 1 year compared to daily somatropin therapy, of course. So again, it's administered once weekly. This is sort of a new paradigm on how we treat growth hormone deficiency. And the injection can be given any time of day or night also. Finally, something to be familiar with. Ascendis Pharma has developed this patient support program called Ascendis Signature Access Program, abbreviated ASAP, which is supported by a team of nurse advocates who can be a single point of contact for both the patients and caregivers and the healthcare providers, and can assist patients throughout their treatment journey, both with patient enrollment as well as activation of treatment, as well as patient access to coverage of this medication and out-of-pocket assistance. There is also a team that was trained as hybrid clinical educators. If patients live far away from the clinic, the education on how to start treatment and how to give the injections and how to work with the auto-injector can be provided by these field-based contacts, which can also be responsible for training how to work with the auto-injector for particular practices that want that. So all through the ASAP program, this can be arranged. And information about this can be found at one of two websites, one for healthcare providers, skytrofahcp.com, and the one for patients and caregivers, skytrofa.com. It has information about all these things. So in summary, in the last 30 minutes, I provided a more practical introduction to sort of a novel delivery platform to treat growth hormone deficient patients with a growth hormone via once weekly administration. I've shown you that following subcutaneous administration, Skytrofa or Lonapec somatropin will release fully active somatropin after auto-cleavage from the TransCon linker in a controlled manner that's controlled by serum pH and normal body temperature. The dose is one fixed dose of 0.24 milligram per kilogram per week. It can be administered anytime, day or night, 5 to 9 days after the last dose was given. It doesn't require refrigeration for up to 6 months. I showed you efficacy data from the phase 3 trial, which was published in JCM, and some of you may have heard something about this from an earlier presentation from Paul Thornton, that there was a treatment difference of about 0.9 centimeters per year between the two cohorts, with a height velocity annualized for the Skytrofa cohort of 11.2 centimeters per year. There were no serious adverse events reported, and there were no treatment discontinuations because of adverse events associated with either treatment modality. And with this, I will be glad to take any questions, and I'll try to open also the Q&A area here.
Great. I'm not sure if we have much time for questions if they want to open up the room, but I'll start with one that we've been getting a lot coming through the Q&A. Can you go over how you follow IGF-1 levels, and how do you obtain these, and how do you target it through troughs and peaks of IGF-1?
Yes, so this is one of the most common questions that our colleagues have. So I've shown you that the peak IGF-1 concentration is reached at about 2 days post-injection, and that the trough is somewhere between 4 and 5 days post-injection, exactly around 4.5 days. So ideally, if we look at what's important to follow, it's the mean concentration of IGF-1, the average IGF-1 concentration, that is going to be our efficacy parameter, as well as partly a safety parameter. So if the efficacy parameter is IGF-1 at average, ideally we get the IGF-1 measured about 4 to 5 days after the injection is given. And this will give us a representation of the area under the curve for the entire IGF-1 excursion during the week between the two injections. Now, it is quite possible that one asks a family to come at 4 days, 4.5 days after the injection was given, but instead the family shows up, 3 days or 6 days after that. And then, of course, one deals with an IGF-1 concentration that's not representative of the average IGF-1 concentration, and some type of conversion or calculation will have to occur. And I know that's in the works. Something will be made available eventually to providers that will allow them any IGF-1 that's not drawn at the ideal average time to convert that value either in absolute concentration or as an SD value to what the corresponding average IGF-1 would have been. And this is going to be quite reliable. It's going to be based on very thoroughly executed pharmacodynamic studies with thousands of samples. And of course, it's going to be most reliable when that IGF-1 is drawn anywhere from 2.5 days to 6 days after the injection is given. So people will be able to rely on sort of a conversion factor or converter that may be provided as a publication or as a paper to help them convert levels that are not obtained at the ideal time.
Great. And what if a patient is unable to take their weekly dose on the scheduled day, or they miss their weekly dose?
So again, if the concentration, if the dose was not, let's give a practical example. If the dose is scheduled to be given on a Sunday and the patient doesn't get it, he or she can still receive the dose on Monday, 1 day later, or even on Tuesday, 2 days later. If it's not given at that time, then the patient needs to go to the next Sunday to resume the weekly injections. There is that 4-day window from 5 to 9 days where it's safe to give Skytrofa, where it's safe to give the long-acting growth hormone dose. I see a question from an attendee is, are there differences in the process of autocleavage dependent on the pH and temperature differences, and can there therefore be different pharmacokinetics? So, so I mentioned that the non-enzymatic autocleavage occurs at normal body temperature and pH, and mild variations in body temperature probably don't make a big difference. The pH is actually more important than body temperature, and the pH is usually quite stable in humans, and so the autocleavage is dependent on normal body pH and temperature. The linkers are specific for the molecule that they need to release. So the chemical composition of a linker for a growth hormone product is going to be different than for another hormone. The linkers are chemically constructed in such a way that they will lead to a specific pharmacokinetic profile for the compound they're supposed to slowly release. And so the linker in Skytrofa is specific for somatropin. There's another question here that says, does the peak concentration in higher IGF-1 lead to any gigantism side effects? Nowhere near +2, +3, so assuming no, can you adjust the dose based on IGF-1, or is weight-based dosing only? Since there's a peak and trough and the IGF-1 varies by week after shot. So, yeah, there's certainly no observation of any undesirable effects on growth of the extremities or so. Again, I mentioned that mean average IGF-1 concentrations were occasionally over +2, but not over +3 standard deviations. How can the dose be changed? This is a weight-based treatment. So the dose is 0.24 milligrams per kilogram per week. And then you calculate the dose based on your patient's weight, and you find the cartridge that has the closest dose for your patient then. If the IGF-1, because the person here asked, can you adjust the dose based on IGF-1? If your mean IGF-1 concentration is too high, if you find it too high, you can decrease the dose based on your observation. But it is predominantly a weight-based dosing at this time. Now, I can tell you that in the extension trial, the current average dose for the population on treatment is already slightly lower than the 0.24 milligram per kilogram per week that's in the label. All right, and so
can I just think about the 7 days on Wednesday to Wednesday, maybe go over the dosing a little bit more?
Yeah, so the question is, why can't one restart the 7-day interval on a Wednesday to Wednesday then and have to wait? I assume rather than have to wait. So you want some stability in your planned dosing, and I think treatment adherence and persistent with treatment is going to be best served when the family takes a day where it's most convenient for them to administer a long-acting growth hormone product like Skytrofa. So if they decide on Sunday to Sunday, they have some play still. They can give it all the way up to Tuesday, but the recommendation is that if you don't have it administer within the 4-day periods around your ideal day, within that 4-day window, then one should go back to the next planned scheduled day for injection. that will lead to more reliable continuation of treatment and a better adherence.
Great. Thank you. And Dr. Baccaleo, they're telling us we need to wrap up. So any final closing thoughts?
Well, I think, it's very important for people to become familiar with the results of the phase 3 trial. I would refer them to take a look at the paper, which was published, I think, in November or early December in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. This is something that none of us are very familiar with, because this is a new approach to replacing growth hormone deficiency. And we need to become familiar with the pharmacodynamics of long-acting growth hormone products. We need to become familiar with sort of the differences that there are in monitoring these patients, and we need to become educated in, how to teach our families as good as possible and how to work with this long-acting product. So, and this goes both for the younger generation of pediatric endocrinologists, as well as for those individuals who've been in practice for decades. But this is an exciting time. We're looking forward also to the results of the extension trial, as well as the specific results for the phase 3 trial, which transitioned patients from daily growth hormone in a study setting to weekly growth hormone. But thanks for your attention.
Of course, I'm going to say thank you. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and joining us today, and we look forward to hopefully having you in person at some of our future meetings.
Well, thanks for having me and allowing me to give a brief sort of practical update for the colleagues. And again, congratulations on a very nice meeting.